Dr. Emily Carter is a brilliant and dedicated surgeon by day, saving lives with steady hands and a clear mind. But when the sun sets, she transforms into Evelyn, a mysterious woman who seeks thrills in the shadows of the city's underground. Why does someone as composed as Emily feel the need to live a dangerous double life? What secrets from her past are driving her to the edge? Step into a world of suspense, secrets, and unexpected twists, where every answer only leads to more questions. Chapter 1: The Perfect Facade. Dr. Emily Carter moved through the hospital corridors with the calm precision of someone who had long mastered the art of control. Her white coat fluttered slightly as she walked, her stethoscope resting comfortably around her neck like a badge of honor. To the staff, she was a paragon of professionalism, steady, unflappable, always in command. Her patients looked at her with a mix of hope and reverence, believing that if anyone could pull them through the darkest hours, it was Dr. Carter. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," a nurse greeted her as she entered the operating room. Emily responded with a warm but brief smile, already mentally preparing for the procedure ahead. It was a high-stakes surgery, a case that required every bit of her expertise. A young man, barely out of his 20s, had been rushed in after a severe car accident. His life was hanging by a thread, and Emily was determined to save it. The surgery was a dance of precision. Emily's hands moved with a grace born of years of experience, her focus unwavering. The room was tense, but she remained calm, her voice steady as she issued instructions to the team. There were moments of uncertainty, an artery that nearly ruptured, a heartbeat that stuttered, but each time, Emily brought the situation back under control with skill that bordered on the miraculous. Finally, after hours that felt like an eternity, the patient's vitals stabilized. The danger had passed. As she stepped back, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. The nurses exchanged glances of admiration, and the anesthesiologist gave her a nod of respect. "Another life saved, Dr. Carter," one of the younger surgeons said, clearly impressed. Emily removed her gloves, her expression calm as ever. "Just doing my job," she replied modestly, though there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, satisfaction, perhaps, or maybe even a hint of pride. As she left the OR, one of her colleagues caught up with her. Dr. Mark Benson was an old friend, someone who had known Emily since their residency. He had always admired her composure. "You're always so composed, Dr. Carter," he said, echoing what so many others had told her over the years. "It's as if nothing could ever shake you." Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We all have our ways of coping," she replied cryptically. By the time her shift ended, the hospital was winding down for the night. Emily made her way to the staff locker room, where she changed out of her scrubs and into a simple, elegant dress. But instead of heading home, she drove to a nondescript building in a less frequented part of the city. Inside, the transformation began. Emily's carefully managed facade started to slip away as she donned a sleek black dress, paired with high heels that clicked sharply against the marble floors. Her makeup was bold, her hair styled to perfection, every detail meticulously crafted to create a new persona. Evelyn. In the dimly lit reflection of a mirror, Evelyn stared back at her with a knowing smile. The woman who looked back was nothing like Dr. Emily Carter, the calm and collected surgeon. Evelyn was a creature of the night, drawn to the thrill of the underground, where boundaries blurred and the rules of the day no longer applied. As Evelyn, she moved through the city with an air of mystery, slipping into a world where she was unknown and unknowable. The club she frequented was a hidden gem, a place where the elite and the enigmatic mingled without pretense. Here, she could be anyone or no one at all. The music pulsed through the air, a seductive rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. As she descended the stairs into the club, Evelyn felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was her escape, her refuge from the rigid life she led during the day. Here, in the shadows, she could let go of everything that was expected of her. But even as she immersed herself in the night, a part of her couldn't help but reflect on the duality of her existence. By day, she saved lives with steady hands and a clear mind. By night, she indulged in the darker side of life, seeking the thrill that only danger and secrecy could provide. The night feeds a part of my soul that the day never could, she thought as she sipped her drink, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. But even as Evelyn, there was a part of Emily that lingered, a part that wondered how long she could keep up this delicate balance. As the night wore on, she danced on the edge of both worlds, knowing that one wrong step could send everything crashing down. But for now, she was content to keep the facade intact, to live the double life that had become both her solace and her curse. In the end, she knew that both Emily and Evelyn were just parts of the whole. And as long as she could keep them separate, she would survive. For now. Did you feel the tension building up as Emily's double life began to unfold? What do you think will happen when her two worlds collide? I'd love to hear your thoughts and predictions for where this story might go next. Drop a comment below, let's start a conversation. Chapter 2, The Encounter. Nathan Reed sat at his desk, the hum of the newsroom around him barely registering as he stared blankly at the screen in front of him. The cursor blinked, taunting him with the emptiness of the document. It had been weeks since he'd last written anything of significance, and the pressure was mounting. He was known for his sharp investigative pieces, for uncovering the hidden stories that others overlooked. But now, all he could think about was the accident. The memory played in his mind like a broken record, the blinding headlights, the screech of tires, and then the crushing impact that sent him spiraling into darkness. The next thing he remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, his body a mass of pain, his vision blurry. And then, through the haze, he saw her. Dr. Emily Carter. Her face was calm, composed, as she leaned over him, checking his vitals. In that moment, she was his lifeline, the one thing grounding him in reality. She had saved him, pulled him back from the brink when death had seemed certain. He owed her everything. But the weeks following his discharge had been a blur of frustration and restlessness. Nathan was a man who thrived on adrenaline, on chasing stories that mattered. The accident had put him out of commission, and now that he was physically recovered, the mental scars remained. He needed something to focus on, something to pull him out of the void. That's when he got the tip about the club. It was supposed to be just another assignment, an underground club that catered to the city's elite, where secrets were traded as freely as the drinks. Nathan wasn't expecting much, maybe a story about corruption or illicit dealings. But what he found that night would change everything. The club was hidden in the basement of a nondescript building, the entrance guarded by a bouncer who barely glanced at Nathan's ID before letting him in. The air inside was thick with smoke and the low thrum of electronic music. People moved through the dimly lit space like shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness and the occasional flash of strobe lights. Nathan moved through the crowd, his journalist's instinct on high alert. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something told him that this place held more than just a typical underground scene. He made his way to the bar, ordered a drink, and scanned the room. And then he saw her. At first, he didn't believe it. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the figure standing near the edge of the dance floor. She was dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair cascading down her back in loose waves. She was laughing at something a man beside her had said, a glass of wine held delicately in her hand. Nathan blinked, certain he was seeing things. That's her, but it can't be. The words slipped out under his breath, a mix of disbelief and shock. He knew that face, had stared at it every day during his recovery. It was the same face that had reassured him when he thought he might never walk again. But here, in this club, she was a different person entirely. Dr. Emily Carter was not supposed to be here. The woman before him moved with an effortless grace, her every gesture confident, almost commanding. This wasn't the composed, almost stoic doctor he knew. This was someone else, someone who belonged to this world of shadows and secrets. Nathan's journalistic instincts kicked in. He couldn't let this go. He had to know why she was here, what she was doing. He waited until she was distracted, then slipped into the crowd, keeping a careful distance as he followed her. She moved through the club with ease, greeting people with a nod or a smile, as if she were a regular. As she headed toward a secluded corridor at the back of the club, Nathan's pulse quickened. He followed, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The corridor was dimly lit, the walls lined with private rooms where muffled conversations and soft laughter could be heard. He stayed a few paces behind her, watching as she stopped at a door and slipped inside. Nathan hesitated for a moment before moving closer, pressing himself against the wall to avoid being seen. The door had closed behind her, but he could hear faint voices coming from inside. He strained to make out the conversation, but it was too muffled to understand. His mind raced with possibilities. What was she doing here? Was she involved in something illegal? The idea seemed absurd. Dr. Carter was the epitome of professionalism, the last person he would expect to find in a place like this. But the evidence was right in front of him, and Nathan couldn't ignore it. He needed to know more. Suddenly, the door opened, and Nathan barely had time to react. He quickly ducked into a shadowed alcove as she stepped out, her expression serious. She glanced around, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, and for a moment, Nathan thought she had seen him. But then she turned and walked down the corridor, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Nathan waited until she was out of sight before slipping out of his hiding place. He had seen enough for one night, but the questions swirling in his mind wouldn't let him rest. He had to know what Dr. Carter was hiding, why she was living this double life. As he left the club, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something big, something that would not only be the story of his career but might also explain the enigma that was Dr. Emily Carter. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that this story could cost him more than he was prepared to pay. Chapter 3: Confrontation. The cool night air hit Nathan like a slap as he stepped out of the club. He had followed her, staying just far enough behind to remain unseen. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing with the question that had been consuming him since he'd recognized her inside the club. What the hell is she doing here? Dr. Emily Carter, calm, composed, the very picture of a perfect surgeon, was not supposed to be leading a double life. But there she was, slipping into the shadows of the underground, and Nathan was determined to find out why. She was ahead of him now, making her way across the nearly empty parking lot. He quickened his pace, knowing that this was his moment. The confrontation he'd been rehearsing in his head since the shock of seeing her had worn off. Emily. His voice cut through the silence, and she froze mid-step, her back rigid. Slowly, she turned to face him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite place, met his. Then her expression hardened. "Nathan," she said, her tone icy and controlled. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his heart racing, his mind struggling to find the right words. "I could ask you the same question." Emily didn't flinch, but he could see the tension in her posture. "This isn't what it looks like." Nathan let out a dry laugh. "Isn't it? Because it looks a hell of a lot like you're living some kind of double life, Dr. Carter." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger flashing in them. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do." He was close enough now to see the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I know who you are, or at least, I thought I did." Emily took a step back, as if trying to create distance between them. "Nathan, you have no idea what you're getting into." "Then enlighten me," he challenged, his voice low, determined. "What's going on, Emily? Why are you here? Why the hell are you pretending to be someone else?" For a moment, she just stared at him, as if weighing her options. Nathan could almost see the gears turning in her mind, the internal debate over whether to deny everything or to let him in on her secret. Finally, she exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "This isn't about pretending." Evelyn is as much a part of me as Emily is. He blinked, taken aback by her sudden honesty. Evelyn? That's who I am here, she said, her voice softening slightly, as if the name itself carried a weight she couldn't bear alone. This world, it's different from the one you know. It's dangerous. And it's mine. Nathan felt a surge of something, fear, excitement, he wasn't sure which. But it was enough to keep him rooted in place. Why? Why risk everything you've built, everything you are, for this? She looked away, her gaze drifting toward the city lights in the distance. Because I need it. The thrill, the freedom, it's something I can't find in the life you know. Nathan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're playing with fire, Emily. Her eyes snapped back to his, and for a moment, he saw the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. I know. But it's the only way I know how to live. The tension between them was thick, a mixture of unsaid words and unresolved emotions. Nathan could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between pushing him away and pulling him closer. He made his decision. I'm not going to expose you, Emily. But I want in. I want to understand why you do this, why you need this life. Her expression hardened again, though there was a trace of uncertainty in her voice. You're making a mistake. This world isn't like the one you're used to. People here, they don't play by the same rules. I'm not afraid, Nathan shot back, though the truth was, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. I want to know. I want to see the world through your eyes. Emily hesitated, her mind racing with the potential consequences. Letting Nathan in meant exposing herself, risking everything she'd worked so hard to keep separate. But there was something in his eyes, something raw and honest, that made her pause. She could walk away. She could shut him out, pretend this conversation never happened, and return to the carefully constructed life she'd built. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option anymore. You want in, she finally said, her voice laced with both warning and resignation. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. Nathan felt a rush of adrenaline as her words sank in. He had crossed a line, stepped into a world he didn't fully understand. But there was no turning back now. Where do we start? He asked, a mix of excitement and apprehension in his voice. Emily's gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. We start with you understanding that once you're in, there's no going back. You follow my lead, you don't ask too many questions, and you keep your mouth shut. Nathan nodded, the gravity of her words settling in. Understood. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of doubt. Finally, she seemed satisfied. Meet me here tomorrow night. Same time. And Nathan, if you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll make sure you regret it. There was no trace of humor in her voice, no hint that she was anything less than deadly serious. Nathan nodded again, more soberly this time. I won't. You have my word. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Nathan standing alone in the parking lot, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. As he watched her disappear into the shadows, he couldn't help but wonder if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. He was in, and whatever came next, he would face it head on. The game had begun, and Nathan was ready to play no matter the cost. Chapter 4, Into the Shadows. Nathan's pulse quickened as he pulled into the parking lot where he had confronted Emily the night before. The reality of what he had agreed to was starting to sink in, and with it came a wave of uncertainty. He'd spent the entire day wrestling with his decision, but every time he considered backing out, something pulled him back in. He had to see this through. As he stepped out of the car, the night air wrapped around him, cool and thick with the promise of secrets. Emily was already waiting, leaning against the side of her car. But this wasn't the Emily Carter he had known in the hospital. Tonight, she was Evelyn, a transformation that was as stunning as it was unsettling. Her hair, usually tied back in a no-nonsense bun, cascaded freely over her shoulders. She wore a fitted black dress that hugged her curves, paired with stilettos that added to her commanding presence. The controlled, clinical demeanor was gone, replaced by a confident, almost dangerous aura. She didn't smile as he approached. "Ready?" Nathan nodded, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. "Yeah, I'm ready." She gave him a long, assessing look, as if measuring his resolve. "This is who I am at night," she said, her voice low and steady. "Can you handle it?" For a moment, Nathan didn't know how to respond. The woman before him was both familiar and a complete stranger. The Emily he had known in the hospital was a healer, a protector. Evelyn was something else entirely, someone who thrived in the shadows, where danger and temptation lurked. But he couldn't back down now. "I can handle it," he said, his voice firm. She nodded, satisfied with his answer. "Follow me. And remember what I said, no questions, and keep your mouth shut." Nathan followed her to a nondescript building on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but as they stepped through the door, Nathan realized appearances were deceiving. The inside was dimly lit, the walls lined with rich mahogany, and the air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. Soft jazz played in the background, but it was drowned out by the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of glasses. Evelyn led him down a narrow hallway, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. They reached a door at the end of the corridor, guarded by a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit. He nodded at Evelyn as they approached, but his eyes lingered on Nathan with suspicion. "This is him?" the guard asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "He's with me." The guard nodded once, then stepped aside to let them pass. Inside, the room was filled with a heavy, almost suffocating tension. The smoke hung in the air like a thick fog, swirling around the dim light of the chandeliers. A long table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by men and women who looked as though they had stepped straight out of a noir film. Their eyes were sharp, their movements deliberate. Here, every gesture, every glance, was loaded with meaning. Nathan's breath caught as he realized what he had walked into. This wasn't just a poker game. The stakes were far higher than money. Secrets were the currency here, and perhaps even lives. Evelyn took a seat at the table, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the other players. Nathan remained standing, unsure of his place in this world. He could feel eyes on him, assessing him, judging him. "Sit," Evelyn said, gesturing to the chair beside her. He obeyed, trying to appear as calm as she did, though his heart was racing. The game began, the players exchanging cards and chips with a practiced ease. The conversations around the table were hushed, the words often cryptic, hinting at deals and alliances far more complex than a simple card game. Nathan watched in awe as Evelyn played, her movements fluid and precise. She was in her element here, completely at ease in a way he had never seen before. But as the game progressed, he began to notice the subtle cracks in her facade. A tightness around her eyes, the way her fingers drummed against the table when she thought no one was watching. He leaned closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "How often do you do this?" She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the cards in front of her. "Often enough." Nathan hesitated, then pressed on. Doesn't it get to you? Living like this?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, without turning her head, she spoke in a voice so quiet he almost didn't catch the words. "Every night I walk a tightrope. Sometimes I wonder when I'll fall." Her admission sent a chill through him. Nathan had expected her to brush off his question with the same confidence she had displayed earlier, but instead, she had let her guard down, if only for a moment. He saw a flash of vulnerability in her, a glimpse of the cost of the life she led. But before he could say anything, one of the other players leaned forward, a sly smile on his lips. "Evelyn," he drawled, "are you going to let your little friend distract you from the game?" Evelyn's eyes snapped back to the table, her expression hardening. "Mind your own business, Victor," she said coolly, her voice regaining its edge. Victor chuckled, but his eyes narrowed as he studied Nathan. Careful, newbie. Evelyn's reputation is well earned. She's not someone you want to cross. Nathan felt a shiver of unease, but he forced himself to meet Victor's gaze. I'll keep that in mind. The game continued, the tension only growing thicker as the stakes were raised. Nathan could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, a heady mix of excitement and fear. He was in too deep now to back out, but a part of him wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. When the game finally ended, Evelyn stood, her expression unreadable. She had won, but there was no trace of satisfaction on her face. Nathan followed her out of the room, his mind spinning with everything he had seen. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Nathan couldn't keep quiet any longer. How do you do it? He asked, his voice full of both admiration and concern. How do you live like this? Evelyn paused, her eyes distant as she looked out at the city lights. I don't have a choice, she said softly. This is the life I've built. And now, it's the only one I know. Nathan wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew it wasn't that simple. This world she lived in, the one he had just glimpsed, was dark and dangerous. It was a part of her, just as much as the brilliant surgeon he had once known. Maybe you don't have to do it alone, he said quietly. Evelyn finally turned to face him, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her eyes. I've been alone for a long time, Nathan. It's easier that way. He opened his mouth to argue, but she shook her head. Don't try to save me. I don't need saving. With that, she walked away, leaving Nathan standing there, conflicted and more intrigued than ever. He had seen the cracks in her armor, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. And despite the danger, despite the darkness, he knew he couldn't walk away now. He was in this, for better or for worse. Chapter 5, Trust and Betrayal. Nathan sat in his apartment, the glow from his laptop casting shadows across his face as he scrolled through page after page of information. The events of the past few nights had left him restless, his mind a storm of questions and doubts. He had agreed to follow Evelyn into her world, but the deeper he delved, the more he felt the ground slipping out from under him. What had started as an investigation into a mysterious double life was becoming something far more complex. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece of the puzzle he was missing, something that would explain why a woman like Emily Carter would lead such a dangerous existence. Determined to find answers, Nathan had begun digging into her past. He wasn't proud of it, but he knew that if he wanted to understand her, he needed to uncover the truth she was hiding. His skills as a journalist had taught him how to navigate the labyrinth of public records, old news articles, and even social media. But what he found left him more unsettled than ever. There had been an incident years ago, buried deep in the archives of a local newspaper. A car accident, eerily similar to the one Nathan himself had survived. But this one had ended in tragedy. Emily had been driving, and the passenger, her younger sister, had died on impact. The article was sparse on details, but it was enough to paint a picture of guilt and loss that had likely haunted Emily ever since. Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as he processed the information. It made sense now, why she would need an escape, a way to cope with the pain. But it didn't explain everything. Why choose such a dangerous path? Why create a whole other identity? His thoughts were interrupted by a notification on his phone. A text from Emily. Evelyn, meet me at the usual spot. Midnight. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. He knew better than to question her summons. Whatever she had planned tonight, he needed to be ready. The club was buzzing with energy by the time Nathan arrived. The usual crowd was there, but tonight, the atmosphere was different, tenser, more charged. He found Evelyn in the back, surrounded by a group of people he didn't recognize. She was speaking in low, hurried tones, her expression serious. Nathan approached cautiously, but before he could reach her, she caught sight of him and waved him over. The others in the group glanced at him with suspicion, but Evelyn quickly dismissed them with a nod. "What's going on?" Nathan asked as they stepped away from the group, his voice barely audible over the music. "There's a deal going down tonight," Evelyn said, her tone clipped. "It's bigger than anything I've brought you to before. I need you to stay close and follow my lead." Nathan's stomach tightened. "What kind of deal?" Evelyn's eyes flashed with warning. "Don't ask questions, Nathan. Just trust me." Trust. The word hung heavy between them. Nathan wanted to believe her, wanted to trust her, but after what he had discovered about her past, he wasn't so sure. He could see the strain in her eyes, the cracks in her seemingly unshakable facade. He wondered if she sensed the same in him. They left the club and drove to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area was deserted, the kind of place where things happened that were meant to stay hidden. As they pulled up, Nathan noticed several other cars already parked outside. Men in dark clothing stood around, speaking in hushed tones, their postures tense. Evelyn led him inside, where a group had already gathered around a table stacked with briefcases. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single overhead bulb that cast long shadows on the concrete floor. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gun oil. Nathan felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back as he watched Evelyn approach the man at the head of the table. He was older, with a scar running down the side of his face, and his eyes were cold and calculating. Nathan recognized the type: ruthless, dangerous, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to kill if the deal went south. Evelyn and the man exchanged words that Nathan couldn't hear. She seemed calm, but Nathan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her thigh. Whatever was happening here, it was dangerous. Far more dangerous than anything Nathan had expected. He moved closer, trying to catch some of the conversation. But before he could, the door behind them burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in, their guns trained on the people around the table. "Everyone down," one of the men shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. Chaos erupted. The men around the table scattered, some reaching for weapons, others diving for cover. Nathan instinctively ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding in his ears. He saw Evelyn dive to the ground, her eyes wide with shock. For the first time, Nathan saw real fear in her eyes. The room erupted into a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Nathan peeked over the edge of the crates, his mind racing. He had to find a way out, but more importantly, he had to get Evelyn out of there. He spotted her crawling toward the exit, keeping low to avoid the bullets that ricocheted off the walls. Without thinking, Nathan sprinted toward her, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Come on," he yelled over the noise. They ran for the exit, dodging gunfire and leaping over fallen bodies. The warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, but Nathan kept moving, driven by the need to get them both out alive. They burst through the door into the night air, but the danger wasn't over. The armed men had surrounded the warehouse, and as soon as Nathan and Evelyn emerged, they were spotted. "Over here," one of the men shouted, and Nathan saw several of them start toward them. "Run," Nathan urged, pulling Evelyn with him as they sprinted toward the fence at the edge of the property. He could hear the men closing in behind them, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. They reached the fence, and Nathan helped Evelyn climb over it. Just as he was about to follow, a gunshot rang out, and he felt a searing pain in his shoulder. He cried out, but forced himself to keep moving, tumbling over the fence and landing hard on the other side. Evelyn was there, pulling him to his feet, her face pale with fear. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice trembling. Nathan nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain as they ran toward the cover of the trees beyond the fence. They didn't stop until they were deep in the woods, far from the chaos they had left behind. Finally, they collapsed against a tree, both of them breathing hard. Nathan clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. Evelyn reached for him, her hands shaking as she tried to assess the wound. "Nathan," she began, but he cut her off. I'm fine, he said through gritted teeth. Just tell me what the hell happened back there. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else, something darker. It was a setup, she said quietly. That man, he's someone I knew from before. He's been trying to take me down for years. Nathan's head was spinning. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want to drag you into this, she said, her voice breaking. But now you're in it, and I can't protect you anymore. Nathan stared at her, a realization dawning on him. You think this is my fault? She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. You think I've been digging into your life, he said, his voice rising. You think I led them to you? Evelyn's silence was deafening. Nathan felt a surge of anger and betrayal. You think you can just dig into my life without consequences, he snapped. I didn't ask for this, Evelyn. I didn't ask to be a part of your twisted game. She flinched at his words, but she didn't deny them. You wanted in, Nathan. You said you could handle it. But now look where we are. He couldn't argue with that. He had wanted in, had wanted to understand the enigma that was Emily Carter. But now, as he sat bleeding in the woods, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. I came here for a story, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But now, I'm part of it. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. And now there's no going back. Nathan didn't respond. He was too tired, too hurt, and too angry to say anything more. But as they sat there in the darkness, a new thought crept into his mind, one that sent a chill down his spine. What if Evelyn wasn't the only one with secrets? What if she was right to be suspicious of him? After all, he had been digging into her past, trying to uncover the truth. What if, in doing so, he had unwittingly set these events in motion? As the night wore on, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He had thought he was in control, that he was the one uncovering secrets. But now, as he looked at Evelyn, he realized that he might not be the only one keeping things hidden. The thought left him cold. And as Evelyn's eyes met his, he knew she was thinking the same thing. Chapter 6: The Unraveling. The soft beeping of monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as Dr. Emily Carter walked briskly through the hospital corridor. On the surface, she was the same composed and efficient surgeon her colleagues had always known. But beneath that calm exterior, she was fraying at the edges. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her 2 lives was finally taking its toll. Her nights as Evelyn had become increasingly chaotic, the danger more palpable with every encounter. But it wasn't just the physical risks that were wearing her down, it was the psychological strain of keeping both lives separate. The tension was constant, a low hum of anxiety that followed her everywhere, even into the operating room. Dr. Carter? A nurse's voice broke through her thoughts, snapping her back to the present. Emily blinked and turned to face the young woman, who was holding a chart out to her. We're ready for the next surgery. Emily took the chart, glancing over the details of the procedure. She forced herself to focus, to push aside the growing sense of dread that had been gnawing at her since the previous night's near disaster. She couldn't afford to let her mind wander here, not when lives were at stake. But as she scrubbed in and prepared for the surgery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Nathan paced his apartment, his thoughts a tangled mess. He was in too deep, he knew that now. What had started as an investigation had turned into something far more personal, far more dangerous. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, about the secrets she kept and the life she led. He tried to justify his involvement, telling himself that he was helping her, that he was protecting her from the dangers of her own making. But the truth was far more complicated. She saved my life, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. But am I helping to destroy hers? The thought gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. He wanted to protect her, to be the one person she could rely on in both her worlds. But the more he learned about her, the The more he uncovered, the more he realized how fragile that balance was. And with every passing day, he felt himself slipping further into her orbit, losing sight of his original purpose. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. He glanced at the screen. Emily. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. Nathan. Her voice was low, strained. I need to see you. Now. Emily was waiting for him in her apartment when he arrived. She looked more tense than he had ever seen her, her usually calm demeanor shattered. She handed him an envelope, her hands trembling slightly. What's this? Nathan asked, already dreading the answer. Open it, she replied, her voice hollow. Nathan tore open the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, typed in bold letters. I know who you are, Evelyn. Choose your career or your life in the shadows. If you don't, I'll destroy both. Nathan felt his blood run cold. Who sent this? Emily shook her head. I don't know. But whoever it is, they know everything. They know about Evelyn, about what I've been doing. Her voice trailed off, and Nathan saw the fear in her eyes, fear that she was losing control, that everything she had fought to keep separate was about to come crashing down around her. What are you going to do? Nathan asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Emily sank onto the edge of her couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know, Nathan. I don't know how to fix this. Nathan sat beside her, unsure of what to say. He had seen Emily in some of the most intense, high-pressure situations imaginable, but he had never seen her like this, vulnerable, afraid. It shook him to the core. You have to fight this, he said finally, his voice firm. You can't let them win. Emily looked up at him, her eyes hollow. How? If I go to the police, they'll find out everything. My career, my reputation, it'll all be over. Then don't go to the police, Nathan said, the idea forming even as he spoke. We'll handle this ourselves. We'll find out who's doing this, and we'll stop them. Emily stared at him, a mixture of hope and despair in her expression. And if we can't? Nathan hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. Then we run. The following days were a blur of tension and paranoia. Emily went through the motions at the hospital, but her mind was always elsewhere. Her colleagues began to notice the change in her. She was more withdrawn, more irritable. The nurses exchanged worried glances when she snapped at them, and the residents whispered about how she wasn't herself lately. Are you okay, Dr. Carter? Dr. Benson, a senior colleague, asked her one afternoon, his brow furrowed with concern. You've seemed off recently. Emily forced a smile, though it felt brittle. Just a lot on my mind, Mark. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine, and she knew it. Every moment she wasn't at the hospital, she was consumed by thoughts of the blackmailer, of the life she had built and how easily it could be torn apart. She barely slept, her nights filled with nightmares of being exposed, of losing everything. And then there was Nathan. She couldn't deny that she had grown closer to him, that he had become more than just a companion in her double life. He was the one person who knew her fully, who understood both sides of her. But with that closeness came danger. The more he knew, the more vulnerable they both became. One evening, as they sat in her apartment, sifting through the few clues they had about the blackmailer, Emily's paranoia finally got the better of her. What if you're the reason they found out? She blurted out, her voice trembling with accusation. Nathan looked up, stunned. What are you talking about? You've been digging into my life, Nathan, she said, her voice rising. What if you led them to me? What if you're the one who brought this on? Nathan recoiled as if she had struck him. You think this is my fault? That I'd betray you like that? I don't know, Emily cried, her composure finally shattering. I don't know who to trust anymore. The words hung in the air between them, a painful silence stretching out. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest, the realization that she genuinely suspected him cutting deeper than he could have imagined. I would never hurt you, Emily, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You have to believe that." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her anger dissolving into despair. "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. Nathan reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, her body trembling with the weight of everything she had been holding in. "I'm sorry," she murmured against his chest. "I'm so sorry, Nathan." He held her tightly, his heart breaking for her. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the darkness closing in, but he knew it wasn't that simple. They were both in too deep, and the only way out was to face the threat head-on. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, his voice steady. "Together." The blackmailer struck again 2 days later. Emily returned home to find her apartment ransacked, her belongings thrown across the floor. Panic surged through her as she searched the wreckage, fearing what she might find. Then she saw it, a single envelope lying on her bed, just like the first. With shaking hands, she opened it. "Time's up, Evelyn. Choose or I'll choose for you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The message was clear, she had to make a decision, and fast. But the choice was impossible. If she gave up her life as Evelyn, she would be surrendering a part of herself, the part that had kept her alive since her sister's death. But if she continued, she risked losing everything else, her career, her freedom, even her life. Desperation clawed at her as she collapsed onto the bed, the note crumpled in her fist. She couldn't see a way out, couldn't see a future where she could keep both lives intact. She was trapped, cornered by her own choices and the shadowy figure who knew her every move. The door creaked open, and Nathan stepped inside. He took one look at her and knew something was terribly wrong. "They were here," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "They were in my apartment." Nathan's jaw tightened as he took in the scene, his eyes darkening with anger. "They won't get away with this," he said, his voice hard. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore, Nathan. I can't keep running, can't keep hiding. I'm going to lose everything." "Then we fight back," Nathan said, his voice firm. "We find out who's doing this, and we take them down." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. "How? How do we fight someone we can't even see?" Nathan took her hand, his grip strong and steady. "We start by facing them head-on. We don't let them scare us into submission." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could find a way out of this nightmare. But the fear was too strong, the uncertainty too overwhelming. She was on the verge of breaking, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on. "What if I run?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if I just leave, disappear, and never look back?" Nathan's heart clenched at the thought. He knew she was serious, knew that she was close to giving up. But he also knew that running wouldn't solve anything, it would only delay the inevitable. "Emily," he said gently, tilting her chin so she had to look at him. "You can't run from this. You've spent years building your life, both as Emily and as Evelyn. Don't let them take that away from you." She searched his eyes, looking for something, hope, reassurance, a reason to keep fighting. And in that moment, she saw it. She saw the man who had stood by her, who had risked everything to be part of her world. The man who believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll fight." Nathan smiled, relief flooding through him. "We'll get through this," he promised. "Together." But even as they embraced, a shadow of doubt lingered in Emily's mind. The blackmailer had forced her hand, had pushed her to the brink. And while she was resolved to fight, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The unraveling had begun, and there was no telling how it would end. Chapter 7: The Final Play. The warehouse stood ominously in the dim light of the moon, its hulking silhouette a silent witness to the confrontation that was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension as Emily and Nathan approached the entrance, each step heavier with the weight of their decisions. They knew this was it, the moment that would determine their fates. Emily paused at the door, her breath catching as she turned to Nathan. His face was set with determination, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He had stood by her through everything, and now, more than ever, she was grateful for his unwavering loyalty. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice laced with fear and resolve. Nathan met her gaze, his expression firm. "I'm with you, Emily. No matter what happens next." Her heart swelled with gratitude and fear, but she knew she couldn't let it hold her back. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's end this." Inside the warehouse, the dim light cast long shadows across the rusted metal and concrete floors. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that sets every nerve on edge. Emily could hear faint voices ahead, and her heart began to race. They were close. As they rounded a corner, the scene unfolded before them. A group of people stood in the center of the room, and at their helm was a man Emily recognized all too well. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized who it was. "Mark!" Emily's voice trembled with shock. "Mark Benson?" Dr. Mark Benson, her trusted colleague, the man she had confided in for years, turned to face her, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Hello, Emily. Or should I say, Evelyn?" Nathan tensed beside her, his hand instinctively moving to the hidden weapon he carried. But Emily reached out, stopping him. She needed to understand what was happening. "Why?" The word escaped her lips, filled with hurt and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Mark's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. "Because you were always the weak link, Emily. I knew it was only a matter of time before your secret life caught up with you." Emily shook her head, trying to process the betrayal. Mark had been with her through some of the most difficult moments of her career. He had been a friend, an ally. And all the while, he had been plotting against her. "You were my friend," she whispered, the words heavy with pain. "How could you do this?" Mark shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "Because power is what matters in this world. You've always been too naive to see that. But when I discovered Evelyn, I knew I could use that to my advantage." Emily's heart pounded as she realized the extent of Mark's manipulation. He had seen her vulnerability and used it against her, turning her own life into a weapon. "What do you want?" Nathan asked, his voice tight with anger. Mark's eyes flicked to Nathan, his expression cold. "I want control, Nathan. Emily's double life was always going to be her downfall, and I planned to be the one to make sure of it." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You're not going to get away with this, Mark." Mark chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You really think you can stop me? I've been planning this for years. I know every move you're going to make." Emily's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this. She had come here ready to confront the person who was blackmailing her, but she had never expected it to be Mark. The betrayal was so deep, so personal, that it threatened to paralyze her. But she couldn't afford to freeze. Not now. Not with Nathan's life and her own on the line. "I became Evelyn to escape," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a weight that surprised even her. "But now I see. I was only running from myself." Mark's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Emily took a step forward, her heart pounding with new resolve. "I thought Evelyn was the answer to my pain, my guilt. But she was never the solution. She was just another mask." Nathan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Emily." But she didn't stop. The words were pouring out of her now, as if they had been trapped inside for years, waiting for this moment to be released. "You're right, Mark. I was weak. I was terrified of facing the truth about who I am. But not anymore. I'm done running." Mark's expression hardened, and he motioned to the people around him. "Take them." As the group moved in, Nathan acted quickly, using the self-defense skills he had honed to protect both himself and Emily. A struggle ensued, chaotic and intense, as the warehouse became a battleground. Emily ducked behind a stack of crates as the room erupted into violence. She could see Nathan defending himself, moving with determination and focus. But the odds were against them, and they couldn't hold out much longer. "Nathan," she shouted over the chaos. "We have to get out of here." He nodded, breaking free from one of the attackers and grabbing her hand. Together, they ran for the exit, the sounds of the struggle fading as they made their escape. But as they reached the door, Mark stepped into their path, blocking their way. His face twisted with anger as he raised his weapon, but before he could act, a loud sound reverberated through the warehouse. Mark stumbled back, shock and pain flashing across his face. Nathan stood firm, his stance protective as Mark fell to the ground, his plans undone. Emily watched, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, sadness, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. This man had been her friend, her confidant, and her betrayer. And now, it was over. Nathan moved to her side, his voice soft with concern. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, though the reality of the situation was still sinking in. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But even as the tension began to ebb, Emily knew that the consequences of her double life were far from resolved. There would be questions to answer, and the cost of her choices was yet to be fully realized. She looked at Nathan, the man who had stood by her through it all, and felt a sense of peace amidst the turmoil. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. But the future was still uncertain, and as they left the warehouse, Emily knew that she would have to confront the reality of both her identities. The final play had been made, but the game was far from over. Chapter 8: Aftermath. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Emily's apartment, casting a warm glow across the room. The tranquility of the scene was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just days before. Emily sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring out the window at the city below. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the turmoil that had shaken her life to its core. The warehouse confrontation had ended, but the echoes of that night lingered in her mind. Mark's betrayal, the violent struggle, and the decisions she had been forced to make, they weighed heavily on her. She had fought to protect the life she had built, but at what cost? The apartment was silent, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city waking up. It was a stark reminder of the solitude she had chosen, the isolation that came with leading a double life. Evelyn had been her escape, her way of coping with the pain and guilt that had haunted her for years. But now, as she sat in the quiet of her home, she wondered if Evelyn had been more of a prison than a refuge. "I've lived 2 lives," she whispered to herself, her voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. But only one was ever real. The truth of that statement settled over her like a heavy blanket. Emily Carter, the dedicated surgeon, was the person she had always been. Evelyn had been a mask, a way to hide from the pain of her past. But now that mask had been ripped away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She set her coffee down and walked over to the door, her heart skipping a beat when she saw who was on the other side. Nathan stood there, a tentative smile on his face. He looked as worn as she felt, the events of the past week clearly having taken their toll on him as well. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He moved into the apartment, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to gauge her state of mind. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression softening. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Emily shrugged, a small, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I'm still standing. I guess that's something." Nathan nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen table. Emily joined him, the two of them sitting in a comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. "I've been thinking," Nathan began, breaking the silence. "About everything that's happened, about what I should do next." Emily looked at him, a flicker of worry in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Nathan hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a notebook. He placed it on the table between them, the pages filled with notes and scribbles. I was going to write a story about you, about Evelyn. But after everything, I realized that's not the story I want to tell. Emily's breath caught in her throat. You're not going to expose me? He shook his head. No. What I've seen, what we've been through, it's made me realize that the real story isn't about you living a double life. It's about why people feel the need to live one in the first place. The toll it takes, the emotional weight of it all, that's the story that needs to be told. Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly, a wave of relief washing over her. Thank you, Nathan. I don't think I could handle being exposed right now. Not after everything. Nathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. You don't have to worry about that. I'm not here to tear you down, Emily. I'm here because I care about you, and because I think your story can help others. But not as a scandal, as a reflection on what it means to be human, to struggle with identity and pain. Emily squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. I'm not sure I know who I am anymore, Nathan. I spent so long being two people that now I feel lost. Nathan's gaze was steady, reassuring. You're Emily. And that's enough. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't out of sorrow, it was out of a sense of release, of finally letting go of the burden she had carried for so long. They sat in silence for a while longer, the bond between them deepening with every passing moment. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft but resolute. What do we do now? Nathan smiled gently. We start over. We build something new, something real. Together, if that's what you want. Emily's heart swelled with hope at his words. She had been so focused on the past, on the pain and the mistakes, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future. But now, with Nathan by her side, she could see the possibility of a new beginning. I'd like that, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Nathan nodded, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her believe, for the first time in a long time, that everything might just be okay. As the morning sun continued to rise, casting a golden light over the city, Emily found herself contemplating the choices she would need to make. The path ahead wasn't clear, and she knew that she would still face challenges and difficult decisions. But for the first time, she felt ready to face them, to confront the realities of who she was and who she wanted to be. Evelyn had been a part of her for so long, a shield against the world's harsh realities. But now, as Emily sat with Nathan, she realized that she didn't need that shield anymore. She had found something far more valuable: trust, connection, and the courage to be herself. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And as Emily looked out at the city, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength and grace. She had lived two lives, but now she was ready to live just one. What a journey it's been, right? Emily's struggle between her two lives has come to a resolution, but it leaves us wondering, what would you have done in her shoes? Could you live with the weight of a double life? I'd love to hear your reflections on the story and how it resonated with you. If you enjoyed this book, please leave a comment below with your thoughts, hit the like button, and consider subscribing for more stories that dive deep into the human experience. Thank you for being part of this adventure.